Okay, guys, let's launch into some lecture material here. I typically like to start our lectures for the first day just asking people what they've heard about the class, do they have any worries, and typically people are a little fearful of this class. They're a little bit worried about microbiology, and sometimes they hear that it's going to be that it was a hard class. I saw a couple people's comments in the icebreaker forum about that, and I think another thing about micro that makes it a little bit difficult is the fact that it is a bit abstract, right? We're looking at microbes. You need a high power objective on a light microscope to see these really with any detail. And on top of that, because they're microscopic, we often resort to the molecular level, looking at some of the chemistry that's going on to be able to differentiate among these organisms. And sometimes the DNA level to study these bacteria and viruses. So that brings people a little bit of fear too, right? Just the word chemistry sometimes gets people a little nervous. But it's also in our cultures, right? We are trained to fear the pathogens. They're in commercials. There's antibiotics out there, and we want to kill them. We want to disinfect areas. We are trained to fear these microorganisms. So we fear them, and for good reason, right? One example of a bacterium that caused great destruction would be Yersinia pestis. That's the bacterium you see here, and it was carried around by arthropods. And ultimately, when humans contracted this Yersinia pestis, they ended up with something called the bubonic plague, or Black Death, they called it. Now, the plague traveled across the globe, moved rather quickly, but not nearly as quickly as it would today. It killed 75 to 200 million people. And that was a huge chunk of the population, especially when this Black Plague or this Black Death was having its effect. So here we have, what they call buboes, which are these bumps that would form where the lymph nodes would become infected with Yersinia pestis. But you could be talking about any other disease here. We fear tuberculosis. This is another bacterium. Smallpox, which is viral. And we'll be talking about a lot of other viruses and bacteria throughout our course. Something I'd like to share is some of the work from Sir Robert Malthus, who did some studies on the human population and what were some of the limits of the human population. So let me just read some of his work here. The vices of mankind are active and able ministers of depopulation. They are the precursors in the great army of destruction and often finish the dreadful work themselves. But should they fail in this war of extermination, so in other words, humans have the capacity for killing one another in wartime, but should they fail in this war of extermination, sickly seasons, epidemics, pestilence, and plague advance in terrific array and sweep off their thousands and tens of thousands. So what he was saying here is that if war doesn't curb the population, then our ability to feed the population will, or disease would do this. And if anyone looked at this curve of the human population, and these numbers on the y-axis are in the billions, okay, so like here we have, they're thinking that we'll have over 9.2 billion in 2075. But if you look at this, it looks like there is no limit, right? In fact, when we look way back here, here's Black Death that we were just talking about. That killed, like I said, 75 to 200 million people. But that was when the human population was maybe 500 million people total. So they think that the Black Death might have caused a third of the people on this globe to pass. Right? So, we certainly are worried about coronavirus and should be, but it's hardly touched some of the other pandemics we've seen. All right. Here we have an image that I just pulled from the internet, and it shows you kind of to scale what kind of pandemics we have seen on this globe. And you see Black Death way back here, right? Black Death has this big circle. They don't know exactly how many, but 75 to 200 million passed from it. Here we have smallpox. Here we have the 1918 flu, 15 million or 50 million. Now this is out of date. Our COVID-19 situation is up to, I believe, 376,000 right now, and over 100,000 in the United States alone, which is a good chunk of the number worldwide. But even if this increases from this point, it's not likely that we're going to see something like the 1918 flu. And this is partly because we have an advanced healthcare system, and we are practicing certain distancing practices that will help to curb the spread and allow us to treat the people as long as they go to hospitals, not all at once, right? So we definitely are going to touch on COVID-19. It's the elephant in the room right now. I would be crazy microbiology professor not to visit it many times. So I'm sorry if you've heard it in the news. It's like you can't get away from it. But hopefully you'll learn some details that other people not taking this class that they don't know. Okay. Now, ultimately, a lot of these diseases, if they are bacterial in nature, we have come up with ways of treating a lot of those through antibiotics. We can't attack viruses quite the same way. There are antiviral drugs we'll talk a little bit about later. But enough about the fearful side, right? This is general microbiology. This is not pathogenic. We will learn a lot about how we might approach pathogens throughout the course. So don't think that that's not the case for you people going into healthcare. We are going to be focusing on that a lot, all right? But when I think about micro, I think about a much broader scale. I think about microbes as the origin of life, okay? Prokaryotes were the first cells on Earth. We're talking, if we go back here to 4.5 billion years ago, when the globe, when the Earth was the origin of the Earth, and then we kind of zoom forward a little bit to around 3.8 billion, we can actually see evidence in fossil features and fossil specimens for prokaryotes being around, and these were the first living cells on the globe. Now this is a time when we wouldn't be able to survive. Certainly in most of the life you think about would not be able to survive in this kind of atmosphere. Not nearly the oxygen in the atmosphere that there is now. In fact, a lot of these prokaryotes go on to evolve into oxygen generating prokaryotes. Basically, you think about plants when you hear photosynthesis. Well, these would be unicellular prokaryotes that came later that would then set the stage for all of the organisms on this globe that are dependent on oxygen, like us, all right? It's not until after, a couple billion years that we saw the first eukaryotes. And of course, our cells are eukaryotic cells. We're not a single cell. We have multiple eukaryotic cells in us, of course. So really, these bacteria are setting the stage for all of life on this globe as we know it. All right. So these things can be deduced from the fossil record. Prokaryotes came first. The kinds of prokaryotes that we saw first are still in existence today in certain areas on the globe. I'll show you in a second. They are responsible for the oxygen accumulation on the globe, which then sets the stage for eukaryotes, whether they're single-celled or multicellular organisms. Okay. So here's one place that we can see evidence of some of those organisms that would have been around way back in the first days of life on this earth. We see them around hydrothermal vents. Very high pressure, very high heat. This is the kind of environment where we still have some prokaryotes that we think were around way back then. Okay? Yellowstone Park. We have these geysers, these hot springs that are boiling hot, and yet organisms live in these regions. Okay? And we're not just talking bison here. Okay? We're talking about the microorganisms that live in these regions. So these are the places where we see something that was an archaic form, and that's why we call them archaea, okay, for these organisms that we think set the stage first when it comes to living cells on this globe. Now this is just, this is actually from out in Yellowstone. Let's listen here.
Physics behind all this and why, oh, and that one blopped down, it made that shape. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right, so that's my my boss, Dr. Ferenzi, giving a very sophisticated explanation of what's going on here. But this is a place where a hot spring comes up close to the surface, and we have a lot of microbial activity here. This is, and some of the colors you see in Yellowstone are not just beautiful, but they are indicating the presence of certain minerals, and in some cases the very prokaryotes that are living there are giving that color. All right, so it's either minerals that prokaryotes are dependent upon that give the color, or the organisms themselves. A lot of times yellow is a sulfur of some sort, and so it smells pretty rotten around some of these hot springs, like rotten eggs. And some of the oranges are iron. Here we see a beautiful array of color. This is the gram prismatic hot spring, and all of these colors are either showing us the minerals or the color of the organisms that live here in a very complex community. Okay, so this All right, so what we see here is the runoff from the gram prismatic. They've done some studies here, and there's actually arsenic in this water, believe it or not, which is a poison to humans. And yet, organisms live in this water, right? These organisms are pretty amazing, and they give a wide diversity of life that we could look at. Some of these organisms, we see some organisms in green here, mixed in with some of these organisms that are in the yellow areas. And of course the green makes us think of oxygen, right? Maybe photosynthesis. And so we see evidence of these photosynthesizing organisms as well out in Yellowstone. And we can even see evidence in fossil records, and just in the fossil beds here in Oregon, you can see the evidence of oxygen because there's rust, okay? The iron in these rock formations would rust only because oxygen was present. You cannot have rust form without oxygen being present. So again, it's more evidence, and when we dig down deeper and do the numbers, we see evidence for these kinds of things, the presence of these kinds of organisms in the fossil record. We can even see the complex communities that give rise to some of the rocks that we see out west. So these are actually stromatolites. And you can see how it is that there's a complex set of communities of microbes in here. And this is very complex. these organisms are living off of one another. One organism's waste is another organism's treasure here in these communities. All right. Some more evidence of stromatolites, these complex microbial communities. Okay, so if I could convince you that organisms were the origin of life, these microbes, you might say, yeah, okay, but we're not related to them. Well, Carl Woese, Dr. Woese would probably argue differently. He, through doing genetic studies, was able to show that there is a common ancestor that very likely gave what was an original ancestor to not just bacteria and archaea, like those crazy ones that live in hydrothermal vents in Yellowstone, but also to eukaryotes, in which we exist. Okay, so here we have plants and fungus and humans, dogs and cats, right? So through genetic studies, he was able to show that there is a link here. There's an ancestor, most likely of an archaic type of organism that existed in the trunk of this tree when it comes to the family record, right? Kind of in this very complex family record of phylogeny that gave rise to all of these organisms. So these prokaryotes exist as bacteria, some of which we see around us today, E. coli, Staph aureus. They exist of archaea, like we see in Yellowstone and hydrothermal vents. But then we also see these eukaryotes. And we do see, by studying them, we do see relationships genetically and structurally, believe it or not, to some of the archaea when we look at these eukaryotes. So we see a lot of some similarities. And I like this image because it actually shows you in a much smaller single branch way out here on the right where we exist in the animal category, right? And how much wider and more diverse the bacteria and archaea groups are, okay? So, we put ourselves on a pedestal, we're a pretty unique species, but we're small in comparison to all of the other life on this earth. Now, one other researcher that would also say that we're related would even suggest that there are parts of our own cells that are there because of prokaryotes. In fact, they're a form of prokaryote that wouldn't be there otherwise. So we'll talk about Lynn Margulis. We'll talk about the endosymbiotic theory. Before we're done, we'll talk a lot more about that. All right. So two people, Carl Woese and Lynn Margulis, who both would absolutely argue that we're related to them, whether we're related to an ancestor millennia ago, Carl Woese's idea, or whether we're related, and you can see the very evidence in subcellular structures of our cells, like with the mitochondria. That would be what Lynn Margulis would say. All right, so maybe if you would swallow that we are related, you could accept that. But today, you might say we're far better without them. Okay, and of course you'd be right. We focus on the nasty ones, right? We'd be better off possibly without certain of these organisms. We don't want the biofilms on our teeth. Okay. Biofilms are a complex community of bacteria that live on the teeth and in any other place where we have fluids that flow. Okay? They exist in our throats, they exist in our digestive tract, they exist in our respiratory tract, they exist in the tubes that bring water to your faucets in your house and any place else that you have running water. Okay? So we focus on these nasty guys, right? We don't want them. We don't want them around. We don't want the yeast, which are also a microbe, they're a eukaryotic microbe, on our feet, right? Athlete's foot. We don't want yeast in the mouth to take over and have thrush, have certain imbalances like that. But we don't oftentimes give credit to the normal flora, the bacteria that naturally grow in our gut, without which we'd be pretty bad off, okay? Those that naturally grow in our throat, those that naturally exist on our skin. These organisms are competing with the nasty guys, all right? So we have to start turning our attention to those every now and then. We don't want to have bacteria on our dentist instruments. These are poorly cared for dentist instruments with bacteria caked on there, okay? We don't want them to grow on catheters. Within 2 or 3 days, these bacteria start to grow as a biofilm inside catheters, okay? We don't want them on contact lenses. I remember I got into kind of a bad habit for a couple days a few years ago, and I started putting my contacts because I was just busy and I didn't have contact solution. I dumped it back in the solution I used previously. And I did that a couple days, not thinking, and my eyes got all red. I had no idea why they were aggravated. And what I had done is I'd done it to myself, right? I allowed for organisms to kind of flourish in that contact solution because I didn't change it out. But we don't give credit to other symbiotic relationships, like these nodules that live on the roots of certain kinds of plants and trees that help to give nitrogen to these plants. Without these plants, animals wouldn't grow, all right? So we eat other animals, but down the line, they're eating some kind of vegetation, okay? So again, we owe our existence to these kinds of organisms. These symbiotic relations are of utmost importance that we understand. Finally, and then we'll get into some real nitty-gritty about these microbes. Again, this is just a smattering across the entire summer term that I wanted to give you here. We put them to work. Our knowledge of viruses and bacteria have allowed us to understand things about our own cells that we might not otherwise have discovered. And we put these bacteria to work all the time. Here we have those yeasts that caused some of the variants of which could cause athlete's foot, could cause thrush. But there are certain types of yeast that we're very happy to have to give us wine and beer, other food items like vinegar, cheese, bread, yogurt. The list goes on and on, okay? So we put these organisms to work, and we use them to actually preserve types of food so that they're actually will be preserved for a much longer period of time. This was really important back when there was no refrigeration, all right? Of course, we use yeast in the formation of bread and yogurt. We use organisms and our knowledge of what they do for us in bioremediation, right? We use it in sewage treatment plants to get rid of waste, right? These organisms, again, are very happy to have our waste, right? It's like gold to them. But this is our way of actually kind of cleaning the environment using these bacteria. We use our knowledge of bacteria to help to clean oil spills. And even out in the backyard, you might be keeping a compost heap. And this is going to be very active with that bacterial activity to break down food, to give back nutrients to the soil when you mix that compost into your garden. We use our knowledge of microbes to form insecticides, right, to help our crops to grow better. We use our knowledge of microbes to produce insulin and all sorts of other drug items that we use to help people and treat people. And finally, I'd just say our knowledge of microbes allows humans to preemptively act when it comes to food spoilage, disease occurrence, our knowledge has led to certain medical and technological advances we wouldn't have otherwise come up with. So we're going to really get into all this. This, again, guys, was just kind of a pass through of all the different kinds of things we're going to talk about for 5 weeks. I thought I'd throw this slide up. If you get into this course, you can buy these little fuzzy like stuffed animals at Giant Microbes. So go on there and check out your favorite microbe, and you can buy big ones. I had a big flu virus for a while, about this size, bigger than my head, and some of them are smaller, like yay big. Okay, so you can get all sorts of neat things. So go on to Giant Microbes. I think it's giantmicrobes.com. It has it right there. All right. So I hope I didn't bore you guys too much. I just wanted to kind of give you guys kind of a quick run through of all the things that microbes mean to me, and we'll jump right into the nitty gritty next time I post. Okay.